portion of these presentations, we will not record the discussion and like what we just did in the beginning, like we're not going to record your individual perspectives with the hope that this is an open, we're sharing information. It's a safe environment. We don't want, someone going on the internet and saying, well, you said this. So just a heads up about that. So originally this talk was going to be given by John Tracy, our previous director of the Colorado Water Center, but I'm excited to give this talk. Water resources and water management in the West is just a continually fascinating subject. And I'm trying to do it justice in a very short amount of time. But there's a lot to go over. So I'm just going to start off with some of the basics, what we're talking about with some of the hydrology overview. What do we mean when we talk about water in the West, and what does that imply? And then we'll get kind of into Colorado specific water uses and management challenges. So hydrologic cycle, maybe you haven't seen this in a while. And this is like a super complicated, of course, it's the USGS, so it's like very technical and complicated. Bottom line, water moves in a cycle. It is never created or destroyed. The water that is on the earth has been on the earth as long as the earth has existed, and it will not disappear. So with that said, it just goes around and around. Precipitates as snow or rain. It goes into the ground. There's groundwater, there's aquifers. Then you've got evaporation, evapotranspiration from plants. And then you incorporate all of the human aspects into this cycle. So we are definitely part of the cycle. We impact it. It impacts us. And, you can see in this diagram, we've got reservoirs, we've got agricultural water use, industrial water use, municipal water use, urban runoff. But all of those components impact the water cycle. And when we talk about, our water supply in Colorado, so typically, Colorado is in the West. You can see here about midway through the plain states, you really start to decrease in total precipitation. This is annual precipitation from 1991 to 2020 averaged over the year. So with the exception of the Pacific Northwest, the West is a very dry place. Colorado, to the east of the Rocky Mountains, we're ranging between 10 and 20 inches per year. Very different than the east, which is ranging anywhere from 40 to even up to 80 inches per year. So highlights the importance of kind of understanding the context of which we are working in, right? It's just an arid place. This is the state of Colorado, more specifically 1981 to 2010. So I believe Larimer County gets on average, and maybe I was looking at Fort Collins specifically, but it's around 16 inches per year, which is quite arid. You get into Weld County and you might be talking less than that. An arid place. So it is compounded by the fact that 90% of our population lives on the east slope. 80% of our precipitation falls on the western slope. So you can see on the eastern side, we're not having a lot of the width of the line of these rivers is representing the amount of flow. So a lot of flow going to the west, some pretty thin lines going to the east. And that also means, we have to have storage. We have to have ways of getting some of the water that's falling in the west over to populations in the east. I'll also mention Colorado, as you know, is a headwater state. There are a few rivers that actually flow into Colorado for short periods of time, but most of our rivers flow out of the state. And that has implications for interstate compacts and decrees and how much water we are obligated to provide to other states and countries downstream of us. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. In addition to those surface water supplies, so I was just talking about rivers, which comes in the form of precipitation, snowmelt, rain. Groundwater supplies. This is our other water supply source. So this map is actually a source or a map of groundwater depletion from 1900 to 2008. And I'm pointing out some of the aquifers in Colorado. So there's the Denver Basin, there's the San Luis Valley, and the High Plains Aquifer, otherwise known as the Ogallala Aquifer. Those are the kind of the aquifers in our state that have depleted significantly over the past, not very long, but really in the past 30 years have significantly depleted. When we talk about groundwater aquifers, again, this is getting back to the hydrology aspects. So there are two different kinds that we talk about. One is alluvial. Those are near the ground surface and are near to rivers and streams. So if you're talking about groundwater, for example, that's right off of the South Platte River, and a farmer is pumping groundwater to irrigate his field that's close to the South Platte River. That's an alluvial aquifer, and it's tied directly to the South Platte flows, which has implications for how we manage that groundwater pumping, because pumping the groundwater, it's depleting away from that surface water connection, you're affecting someone's water rights. And Colorado is a state that has integrated groundwater surface water management, which actually is fairly unique. In the West, groundwater is a mess for management in the West. And it's a whole range of different ways of managing it in different states. There's a lot of like local control, a lot of different management styles out there. But anyway, alluvial aquifers, close to the streams, tied to the surface water. Bedrock aquifers tend to be farther down below the ground surface. They're not well connected to streams. They're often non-renewable. So we're talking about, the Denver aquifer, San Luis Valley, a lot of parts of that are the bedrock aquifer. In terms of water use for groundwater, 85% of Colorado's groundwater is actually used for irrigated agriculture, and 60% of groundwater use is from non-renewable sources. So the renewable sources are kind of the alluvial aquifers, where that's cycling and connected. This is a map of groundwater wells by use in Colorado. So the green is for irrigation of agriculture. Kind of the gold is domestic and the purple is municipal. So you can see some areas stand out right away. San Luis Valley for irrigation, South Platte River, Denver Basin is the purplish and gold area right there. So these are areas that, we're tapping pretty heavily our groundwater resources, and a lot of times unsustainably. So when we talk about water in the West, we're talking about an arid environment that doesn't have a lot of precipitation, but in mountainous areas, like we are so blessed with in Colorado with the Rocky Mountains, we get snowpack that falls in the winter. However, a snowpack melts in the spring. We want to use that water the whole year round. So we have to come up with this whole system of storing the water in reservoirs, constructing dams, balancing those flows out over the summer and the rest of the year when the water is needed. In addition, we've got, a system of ditches and canals to distribute the water, moving it from a natural stream and to the use where it goes. And canals is carrying the water returning it back to the river. And then that interaction with groundwater as well. We have a really interesting case, especially in the South Platte River Basin, where that tie of groundwater and surface water is so important, and it is a part of our water management. So a farmer irrigates his field, some of that water goes back into the ground, and that water must go back into the ground for the next user to use it. It's part of the water rights system. So if that farmer becomes really efficient and stops using quite so much water and there's less water going into the ground, he actually has to provide some additional water, in some cases. In the lower Arkansas River Basin, they have to augment their supply if they install more efficient irrigation. So it's very complicated. Sorry. Whoever said it was, oh yeah, it's mouse me. It's complicated. We're going to talk about that more, but the return flow aspect and how it ties into our water rights management is very interesting and a complicating factor of becoming more water efficient in our state. So this is not an example of Colorado, but it gives a really good example of how flow regimes of rivers change after dams are installed. So this is a river in North Dakota. You put in the dam, dam fills up. This is the daily flow average over the course of time. And you can see there are years where there's just these peak flows, huge flows. This is over the course of 1 year, what that flow would look like. So you can see this is like the days of the year. So 91, that's in like March, April-ish, you're getting a peak flow, and then another one in the summer. And that was pre-dam. So this is the natural kind of flow regime. When you put in a dam, the purpose of that is to essentially get rid of that peak flow, so you're not having flooding, and supply higher base flow during those drier parts of the year. So you have kind of a sustained water supply that's going down the river. The South Platte River used to go dry all the time, and it does get dry when they put a call on the river, and they essentially that does still happen, but historically the river would go dry for periods of time because that was just what happened in late summer, especially around this time of year. With all of the water management and the return flow aspects that we now are doing with the South Platte, the river itself flows year round, unless they're putting calls on the river to essentially allocate all the water in the river. But it's a really interesting aspect of kind of Western water management is the impact on these flow regimes, and then the impacts on our environment and communities as well. This is not to say that, you know, peak flows and floods don't still happen, right? We learned that fairly continually in Colorado. So, but it gives you an idea. It kind of evens out the flow and creates a higher base flow during those dry times of the year. These are Colorado's 10 largest reservoirs. So Blue Mesa is the largest, but you know, you can see Horseshoe, gigantic. It's like number 7 on the list.
Carter Lake doesn't even make the list.
Carter Lake does not make the list. No, sir. So these are huge reservoirs, huge systems, water storing capacity. And some of those reservoirs actually hold water from other watersheds. So as I mentioned before, you know, a large portion of our population lives on the eastern side of our state, whereas the water flows primarily on the western side. We have 44 structures in Colorado that divert water from one watershed to another. The majority of those divert water from west of the Continental Divide to east. The largest diversions, these are just the South Platte River Basin, Adams Tunnel, Roberts Tunnel, and Moffett. Those are the largest ones in the South Platte, but as you can see, they're all over the state, these diversions. And again, this is bringing water where people are in their state, which becomes complicated and political for various reasons. This is the Colorado River average daily flow at Hot Sulphur Springs. So this is kind of the headwaters area of the Colorado River in our state. And you can see here, this is the light green is the highest flow year on record. The red is the lowest flow year on record, so 1907 and 2002. The light blue here is the average flow before the Colorado Big Thompson project, which we'll learn all about, which takes water from the Colorado River, brings it over, stores it in Horse Tooth, and we use it. About 50% of our water supply is from Colorado Big Thompson in Fort Collins, saying other communities that's actually larger. But this is the average flow before the dam. This is after the dam. So after CBT, sorry, and before the Windy Gap project, this dark blue line is after the Windy Gap project. So we're taking those peak flows, we're reducing it down, we're diverting a significant amount of water over to the east slope. This is related to my previous work in the Colorado River Delta. So the Colorado River, I like to think of the Colorado River and the South Platte River as really the two, maybe the two, I shouldn't even say. There's a lot of Western rivers that are very, very taxed, and we use essentially to their full extent. We use it for municipalities, we use it for irrigation, we use it for industry. The Colorado River, this is a graph that shows discharge near the mouth of the river, which is down here at the Gulf of California. So discharges, this is 1910 all the way through 2000. This shows Hoover Dam was completed in 1935. So you can see, with the exception of some very wet years in the 80s, the river stopped flowing to the Colorado River Delta. And it turned a huge, massive wetland area that is in the middle of the desert into desert. So there's really big ramifications for that. Whose responsibility is it to restore the delta? How do we do that with limited water that everyone is using? And this is just a picture of, this is the Morelos Dam on the US-Mexico border. This is the Colorado River flowing. Yuma, Arizona is up here. Colorado River flows. This is the last dam on the Colorado River. Essentially, all that remaining water that is, it is through the 1944 US-Mexico Treaty, they're required to provide a certain amount of water to the Colorado River to Mexico every year. At the border, that all gets put into an irrigation canal, which is then used for farms and cities, just like in the US. And this is the Colorado River in Mexico. You can see there is no river, it's dry. And this is a picture of what used to be kind of these vast wetlands in the Delta. It's just a dry kind of landscape. There's very big social implications, political, economic, environmental. So going back now to Colorado. So when we look at the different water uses in our state, agriculture is a big user. So if we look at water diversions, this is the amount of water that we have in our state that's being diverted from different uses. That means like diverted off of a river. About 87% goes to agriculture, about 7% municipal, industrial, and then this recreation and fisheries is kind of it's a diverted but ultimately not consumed. So I'll talk about that. So when we talk about consumptive use, this is water that is taken up by plants, it's taken up by people. It's used in a way that it doesn't return to the system. It's consumed fully. So in my example of, a farmer irrigating his crops, let's say he applies, some water to a cornfield. Let's say 60% of that water is actually taken up by the corn and used to grow. But 40% goes back into the ground and goes along and someone else uses that water. So that's that difference in the numbers. The amount of water diverted versus actually consumed. So if we're talking about consumption, 89% of the water is consumed by agriculture, 4% is industrial, and 7% is municipal. So those numbers kind of change a little bit when we talk about consumptive use. Any questions so far? Feel free to just interrupt. Yeah.
Let's say in Mexico, so the treaty, the water goes through the canal, not through the river delta anymore?
Well, so the US is obligated to give a certain amount of water to Mexico every year. Mexico decides whatever they want to do with it and has their own system of managing water rights and access. And, historically in the Mexicali Valley and the San Luis Valley, there is a lot of irrigated agriculture. Mexicali is a large city with over 1 million people that uses water from the Colorado River. So, there's no water in the river once you hit Mexico because it's diverted for Mexico's use. Yeah.
These figures, are they by water year or is it from just historical data or is it like just an annual?
Yeah, I'd have to look up. It's actually from this. I don't know. I'm sure it's an average over a certain number of years, but 2008 to 2014, average deliveries. Yeah.
What's the age of Mexico's water rights in relation to everything upstream? So are there some that have to do without to ensure Mexico gets what it needs every single year, or do they go without sometimes?
No, they never go without. They always, so we'll talk about this, when we get into, I think, our next session on water law. But the Colorado River, there's upper basin states and the lower basin states. There's a certain amount of water that's allocated among those, and then there's a certain amount of water that's allocated to Mexico. I believe it's 1.6 million acre feet is Mexico's allocation. And that has to be met every year. It's a treaty. It's different than like within the state, you have water rights that is managed by the state. These treaties and the interstate compacts, they're at a different level than kind of the water rights administration in the state. Let's say, so what's been happening in the Colorado River is that we've been depleting the water stored in Lake Mead and Lake Powell. We got real close to a point where it was looking like Arizona and California might not get total their allocations. They've been reducing their usage, as has Colorado and other states, but there's a whole ranking system of how those cuts are made and who gets the cuts. Arizona takes a lot of cuts. But the treaty with Mexico is always has to be complied. But there's negotiations there. There's always ongoing negotiation. There's these minutes that are addendums to the treaty, and they're part of the interim guidelines that were developed. So they're actively negotiating what that looks like in the future, and sharing shortages is a part of that conversation. So, yeah.
My question is much more basic.
Okay.
So an acre foot, is that if there was a foot of water across an acre? Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's like if you think of a football field of 1 foot of water, that is an acre foot. And I apologize, I usually define that somewhere, but miss that here. And that is a common, people are like, why is that used? It like makes no sense. But it's what is used and everyone is like, oh yes, 1,000 acre feet and acre feet this and acre feet that, but it's a very strange term. Yeah. Yeah, you really have to like work with the numbers a bit to know the significance of it, like what it means. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about water management challenges, not just for Colorado, but for the whole West. A changing climate. So this is a big one. And while Colorado and the Front Range specifically, the climate models so far, they're not necessarily saying we're going to have less precipitation or we're going to have more precipitation. It's kind of like we're in kind of an uncertain, like maybe we'll stay the same, maybe it'll be a little bit. So the precipitation is not clear on what the Front Range is facing, could be similar. What is very clear, however, is that temperature is increasing. And that has a lot of implications for our water. First and foremost, plants need to use more. So that means in urban areas, if it's really hot, people are going to be watering their lawns more. Farmers are going to need to irrigate their crops more. If we think about our forested mountainous regions, that is also going to use more water. All those trees, they use more water when it's hot. And so that has really big implications for our water supply and just the overall amount of water that is available for our uses and the demands on that. It alters hydrologic patterns. So, we're seeing changes in when snow melt is happening, when snowpack is happening. And then there's less certainty in understanding drought and flood frequencies and magnitudes. That's a big one. And secondly, which we've already touched on, demographic change. So we are having a lot of population growth in Colorado. We're especially in the Front Range, we're one of the fastest growing areas. I think it's cooled down a little bit, but still growing very quickly. This means we have increased competition, we have changes in our relationship with water, and we are going to be seeing different priorities come up for water uses. So one of the things that's going on right now is just, buy and dry as municipalities grow. Where does that water come from? Well, as you saw in our charts previously, a lot of water is being currently used by agriculture. So municipalities are increasingly changing over water rights, purchasing water rights from agriculture and changing those over to municipal use. And there's we'll get into lots of examples. We'll have Thornton Water come speak. But examples of how can we do this better? What are some collaborative solutions to this? Because we are an agricultural state. It's a big part of what the state is. We like food. We like food security. How can we utilize water, maintain agriculture, and also ensure that growing communities have access to water?
Karen, I don't have too much.
No, go ahead.
It will be covered, but are we gonna chat about actually change the water rate increase use? In the draft?
We'll get into that in the water law session. How much depth are you looking for?
Acre foot.
Good response. Yeah, we'll get into that in the water law session, and we'll have folks, if you want to go into more depth, you can follow up with them afterwards. So, yeah, but they usually talk about, the length of time it takes and the process and how fun it is. Yeah, so this is just a few more charts showing those challenges. So, with current climate projections by 2050, a normal year in Colorado is expected to be up to 3 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than 2012, which at the time of publication was the warmest year on record. I think that's probably not true anymore. That could be this year, I don't know. And then this is a map from the Department of Local Affairs, the state demographer, showing counties' projected population change. And the dark red areas are those that are projected to grow the quickest. Front range counties being first and foremost, the most fast growing, Larimer and Weld at the top of that list. So, does Colorado need more water and the West to address these challenges? What do you think? See some heads nodding. Well, interestingly, we have become a lot more efficient in our water use, and trends over time. This is, I believe it's the total US, so it's not just the West, but this shows population growth. Population growth, this is millions of people, so this is the US, and then withdrawals in billions of gallons per day. On average, from 1950 to 2015, you could see population is still growing, but around, the year 2000, 2005, we kind of stopped the growing of withdrawals and started to decrease withdrawals. So both for surface water and groundwater withdrawals. Well, groundwater is kind of the same. Surface water withdrawals have gone down significantly while population is still increasing. And then if we look at Colorado specifically, this is not Colorado specifically. This is divided up into different uses of water. So the brown is total water use, greenish is agricultural water use, purple municipal, red thermoelectric, and this is the population line. So you can see total water use, again, going down, even with agricultural water use. You can't see it very well because of the scale, but agricultural water use going down, population still increasing.
What is thermoelectric water? You said generation?
Yeah.
But that's a return to the river, most of it, isn't it?
Yeah, so this is not just, it's this graph is not showing like consumptive use, it's just
Okay.
water use in general,
Okay.
diverted.
Karen, could you go back one slide?
Yeah.
So with the trend line of population going up and then the use of water going down, I think this is one of the questions I asked in my first homework assignment, was as that population trend line goes up, the depletions go down. At some point, you're going to reach like maximum conservation, and then that will start to trend up again, the population. Is that true?
Possibly, but I think we have a very long way to go before we reach maximum conservation. Like a very long time. And we'll get into that, but
Okay.
yeah. Good question. So, I'll just wrap up and we can take a few more questions. I think we have. Oh, Patty is here. Do you want to go get Patty? Is she here? Yeah. We're gonna have a discussion period after Patty presents. I think she'll need to go soon. But so as we kind of shift water use around, let's say we shift it to municipal use. Well, that might affect the return flows in a different area, or it affects the timing. Now we no longer need, that huge delivery in June. We need it, the course of the summer because it's a municipality. We need it also into the winter. And there's just different challenges for managing water associated with shifts in water use, and also social and economic challenges. So what is equitable? and who has access to water, who decides who gets to buy and dry. Is it the person, the highest bidder? I don't know how it's going right now. So also we need to better understand and evaluate the social and economic value we get from effectively managing our water resources. Trying to take more of this holistic and collaborative approach instead of these incremental kind of emergency type situations to water management. And then trying to create more inclusive and equitable environment to engage people in the discussion who have not been engaged historically. And that means, not, for example, tribal populations that haven't previously been involved at all in discussions in Colorado River management. That's taking on a huge kind of resurgence right now. There's a lot of discussion and effort to bring tribes into those negotiations, which has never been done before, or at least not meaningfully. And then in our own region, who are the folks that have been left out of the conversations? How are we able to grow, these smaller communities that don't have the historic water rights that a town like Greeley has? And how can we work as a region to try and do water management more equitably? So those are the things that we're looking out for. And I know I'm already a little bit over time. So any questions before we get into our next presentation? We do have like 20 minutes for discussion after Patty's talk as well. So maybe we should just hold and get into Patty's talk. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And Patty, do you have your?
It's online.
It's online. Okay. So while she is getting it pulled up, we'll give a short introduction to Patty. Thank you so much for being here. So Patty Reddig is the head archivist at the Water Resources Archive at Colorado State University Libraries. She's built the archive to hold over 100 distinct collections documenting Colorado's water heritage by engaging with the water community across the state. This involves working with people throughout the university as well as with state and federal agencies, ditch companies, businesses, and individuals. She earned her Master of Library Science from University of Maryland, College Park, and her BA in English from Wittenberg University. She's been with the Water Resources Archive since its beginning in 2001. So she has been fundamental in just its establishment and what it is today, which is really unique for the region. She also conducts extensive outreach through articles, exhibits, and presentations to further the cause of preserving the state's water heritage. So thank you, Patty, for being here.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Great. Do we have a clicker or do I just need?
We do not. I
Okay.
forgot my clicker, so you're gonna have to, do you want me to do it for you?
We'll see how much I roam around. So I'll try and stick close and if I
Okay.
get enthusiastic,
Let me go sit.
we'll see what happens. Okay, so yes, my main job at CSU is to focus on Colorado water history. So that's what I do a lot of pretty much every single day. So it's really exciting. It's really fascinating. And I'm glad to share what I know with you. So we're going to talk about Colorado water history today for about half an hour-ish. Cut me off if I'm going too long. And so hopefully you all will have come away with something of some level of interest or about all of Colorado water history or a certain piece of Colorado water history that we're going to talk about. We are only going to cover some highlights, but I'm always happy to provide more information and I'm always happy to answer questions. I'm thinking maybe one of your first questions is, what are we talking about when we're talking about Colorado water history? So in terms of history, when we talk about history, we're talking about change. We're talking about not just the normal, ordinary, everyday, but something that changes significantly, something that has impact. So that's the history part. For the water part, we're typically talking about water supply, where's water coming from, and we're talking about what the use of that water. So who's using it and what are they using it for? The who part could be either nature, the environment, wildlife, or people for certain. So when we're talking about people in terms of water, especially in Colorado, we're typically talking about things like engineering or infrastructure or politics or law or different events that happen, different people or organizations that are involved. So we're talking about all those kinds of things. In terms of just getting started on the bigger picture, I'm going to point out two things that are probably pretty obvious to you, having already lived in Colorado. One being that there's a limited water supply. It's not increasing. It's pretty much been more or less the same for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And on my really, really basic map here that we're going to be diving into, you probably know that it's not shown here, but we've got the Rocky Mountains, the Continental Divide, and that runs through our state, which means that the rivers that rise in those mountains all flow out of the state. So there are two minor exceptions I'll point out. We've got the Cimarron River down here that just comes in and goes back out really quickly, so we don't really talk about that one. And then up in the northwest corner, we've got the Green River coming in, picking up the Yampa River and going right back out. So those are kind of the exceptions, but for the most part, all of the water coming into or arising in Colorado, falling as precipitation, is naturally flowing out of the state. So limited water supply, surrounded by other states who are depending on the water that's coming out of Colorado. And then, of course, there's increasing population in Colorado, certainly since the 1850s. This area, this land that's been limited by this rectangle of our state borders, has increased by millions of people, again, with basically the same amount of water. So that sets us up for conflict. Human nature, we want what we want. Conflict ensues. So that's a big part of Colorado water history. But as part of that, with the conflict that happens, we get the opportunity for cooperation, for collaboration. And you'll see a lot of that as I go through this. We also get a lot of opportunities for innovation, for doing things differently, for thinking about things differently. And so you'll see that as well. So we are going to look at history statewide. It's not all just going to be about northern Colorado, but the water across the state is all connected. The events, the issues are all connected, all relate generally across the state. And so I will be working to connect any event in a different part of the state back to northern Colorado. So we are going to get started here in 1852 in the San Luis Valley. So this is the year 1852 when Hispanic settlers dug the People's Ditch in the San Luis Valley. So this was a way to divert water from the river there to their fields to irrigate. Just a few years before this, the land was part of Mexico. It was a totally different country. At this point, part of the US, not even part of Colorado yet. Colorado didn't exist yet. But this system that they started there in 1852 was an irrigation system called an acequia. So an acequia system is not only for irrigation, a way to divert and get water to fields, but also is a way the community lives and operates together, a way to share the water, a way to share maintenance of the system and really come together as a community and a way of life. Still operates that way in certain parts of the San Luis Valley today. So connecting that back to northern Colorado, in the late 1850s, early 1860s, a young man went through this area. His name was Benjamin Eden. And he was, young man, wanted to pursue his fortune in gold fields, wanted to, make his money prospecting for gold. Didn't exactly work out for him that way, but he came through this area, saw the acequias, the irrigation system, and eventually settled in northern Colorado in 1864. So he is credited as one of the people who really brought irrigation to northern Colorado. He and his colleagues built a number of irrigation systems, not just some small ditches here and there, but some large systems still operating today. And just a few decades later, 1884, he gets elected as the governor of Colorado. So water was really part of his life and what he accomplished. So during this period, the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, there was a lot of increase, a huge increase in water use, a lot of ditches being constructed, dams, there were reservoirs beginning to be built. So huge increase in water use, mostly for irrigation purposes, and increasing population as well. So by 1876, the territory at the time had what it took to become a state. So 1876, Colorado became the 38th state in the Union. And as a state, we needed a constitution, so that got written, and the law of prior appropriation got written into the state constitution. And so that is the water law that says first in time, first in right. So whoever is able to divert from a stream first and put that water to beneficial use, they will have the first right on the river, and so on and so forth down the line. So prior appropriation gets established in our state constitution. Part of the reason for that, not the entire reason, but part of the reason for that is because of an 1874 dispute between Greeley and Fort Collins. So 1874 summer, it was hot, and Greeley, they noticed less water in the Poudre River than they expected or than that they wanted, and they noticed it, and they started to come upstream to see what was going on, and they found that in Fort Collins, in this area, there was more diversion happening. And they were like, wait, but we were here, we did that first, we should get the water. And so there was a dispute. I don't know how violent it actually got. But they talked about it, they worked it out. And so the idea of prior appropriation, we were here first, we were doing this first. Instead of we're higher on the stream, we get the water first. They said that system isn't going to work. So whoever actually diverted first and put it to use first was going to get the right to that water. So that's an idea that also came out of mining in the mountains. And so that idea, that prior appropriation system, was a big change in how other states, especially eastern states, dealt with water. And so that was significant as an inclusion in the state constitution. And since that system was established, that system of water rights, first in time, first in right, by along each stream, the state needed a way to keep track of all that. And so a few years later, 1881, they set up a system. They set up the state engineer's office. That office still exists. It's now called the Division of Water Resources. Some people use the two names interchangeably. There is still a state engineer. So that office is significant statewide. It's got divisions, it's got districts, it's got the division engineers, it's got the water commissioners. So those are the people on the ground actually administering water rights across the state of Colorado.
Question, Colorado becomes a state and then they put in this law of first in time, first right.
Yeah.
Was that the first state that had done that?
I believe it was.
I just curious.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Especially for the constitution, right?
Well, the concept of doing the law like that existed. I believe it was the first to put it in the Constitution and operate that way. Yeah, yeah. So it's very significant. So the state engineer is his office, and all the employees there are working on administering water rights across the state. Right. Okay. So one of the early people, a few years after this office was created, came along mid 1880s. His full-time job during the school year was that he taught as a mathematics professor at Colorado Agricultural College, now called Colorado State University. This young man had an engineering background, and so during the summers, he worked for the state engineer's office. Make a little money, have something to do, and one of his jobs during he did this for a few summers. One of his main tasks was establishing gauging stations along the Poudre River here in this area. His name was Elwood Mead. Is anybody familiar with Elwood Mead? Nobody's like, yes. Okay. So Elwood Mead, if you've heard of the name at all, it's in relation to Lake Mead. So that's the reservoir held back by Hoover Dam. created by the Bureau of Reclamation. Elwood Mead went on after he worked in Colorado. He became Wyoming, the first territorial engineer and their first state engineer. He did other things in his career, but he eventually became the commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation, which built Hoover Dam. They named Lake Mead for him upon his death in 1936. So I'd like to stress that this person who rose to one of the top water agencies in the US government got his start with Western Water right here in Fort Collins. So significant nationally. So speaking of the Bureau of Reclamation, that agency got started in 1902 as the Reclamation Service. Their mission was reclamation, and what they meant by that was reclaiming land, basically turning dry land into irrigable land, irrigated land, growing crops. Their first project in Colorado began just 1 year later, so 1903, and this was the Uncompahgre project. This is on the west slope. Basically, it's a trans-basin diversion from the Gunnison River into the Uncompahgre River. So this is beginning 1903, mainly completed by 1912. And we will come back to the Northern Colorado connection with that in a couple decades. But first, we're going to talk about how the courts got involved, especially the Supreme Court. So as we talked about, Colorado's rivers flow out of the state. So this court case, Kansas v. Colorado, got started in 1901, and this is in relation to the Arkansas River. Kansas felt that they weren't getting what they should be getting, weren't getting their normal flows by 1901 out of the Arkansas River. So they brought suit against Colorado. Took 6 years to resolve through the U.S. Supreme Court. So 1907 got a decision. Okay, great, moving forward. Just a few years later, 1911, Wyoming brought suit against Colorado. So this is the second interstate court case in the country. So Kansas was the first, Wyoming was the second, both involving Colorado. What do you think is going to happen? More of these are going to come along, right? Because all the rivers flow out and Colorado's developing, and other states are watching what Colorado's doing and wanting water as well. So this is going on 1960. Well, and I didn't mention the 1911 case, the Wyoming versus Colorado, that didn't get resolved until 1922. So these things take a long time. And in the meantime, 1916, it wasn't exactly Nebraska versus Colorado, but it was similar. It was about to be. That was being pursued. By 1920, California was really interested, was really quite eager to develop the Colorado River, to start building dams, more dams that already existed, holding back water, preparing for more irrigation. And so again, that was going to be a big deal. And so by that time, 1920, this man, Delph Carpenter, who was a water lawyer from Greeley, he was actually directly involved in Wyoming versus Colorado. And he was directly involved in a case that was the equivalent of Nebraska versus Colorado. So he was involved in both of those, being a water lawyer based in Greeley. And he was the person who started thinking, how do we stop this? How does Colorado stop getting sued, stop being taken to court, especially the US Supreme Court, by our neighboring states? How can we reduce litigation related to water? Because the first case having taken 6 years, the second case, it was in progress at the time he was thinking about this, but ending up taking 11 years. Those were cases that took legal time. They were, going through the court, they were taking up the time of lawyers, they were taking the state's money, and they were delaying any development that everybody wanted to happen. So Delph Carpenter is thinking, how do we get around this? How do we limit or reduce or entirely eliminate this kind of litigation? So he is the person who came up with the idea of interstate river compacts. So this was an idea where how could states that share a common river agree to use that river before lawsuits happened? How could the states come together and agree on how to do this? So the first interstate river compact that got completed, that got agreed to, was the Colorado River Compact, and that was in 1922. So that compact is between the 7 basin states that share the Colorado River, as well as the federal government. So that was a big deal for 7 states and the federal government to come together, agree on how to use the river. They were allotted 1 year for negotiations. They got it done in 11 months. This was entirely new. Nobody had done this before, but Carpenter was thinking basically about treaties between countries. How could this be applied between states within the United States? So he represented Colorado as the negotiations happened. Like I said, they got it done in 11 months, agreed to it November 1922. It didn't actually get finalized and ratified by Congress and the states involved for several more years. And you may be hearing about it in the news today. It is still showing up easily on the radio and the newspapers, wherever, at least once a week, if not more often these days. I like to remind people that this was an experiment. This was brand new. They didn't know what they were doing. They were doing their best. They were collecting information. They were negotiating among the different states' interests, but it was an experiment. They didn't know if it was going to work out, and they'd probably be among the first people who would be surprised that it's still in effect 102 years later. But other compacts did follow after the Colorado River Compact, including the South Platte Compact, as well as others. And there have been, some could say, improvements to interstate river compacts since that first one. But that was definitely very significant change for Western water. And again, coming out directly of Colorado and really. And of course, in the meantime, during all of this, nature is happening. By the 1930s, we've got the Dust Bowl, really significant drought, really devastating. And drought recurs throughout the decades. And whenever drought occurs, people can actually see crops drying up. People can actually experience not getting enough water to put on their fields. And so people start thinking, how do we get more water? And in Colorado, people on the Front Range on the eastern side were looking west going, there's a lot of water on the west side. It's not being used. And so they have this idea for decades of, well, let's see if we can bring that water on the west side over to the east side. And by 1937, primarily, again, a group out of Greeley was looking west going, let's get some of that Colorado River water and bring it east and put it on our fields. And so the state created a lot of legislation in 1937 that created different organizations that enabled that Trans Mountain project to be built. So what I'm talking about here is the Colorado Big Thompson project. Again, still implemented today, still moving water. And the main agency involved in that, and so the Colorado Big Thompson project was built by the Bureau of Reclamation. This one, huge Trans Mountain water diversion project. That project is now run by Northern Water. So they were created in 1937 through this legislation. Their full name is the Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District, shortened to Northern Water. And then their counterpart on the west side is the Colorado River Water Conservation District, often shortened to the River District. So those are the kind of the sibling agencies that have different roles. Sometimes they collaborate on things, and sometimes they have conflict between them. Again, something in the news currently is conflict between those two organizations. And then also the Colorado Water Conservation Board, which is a statewide agency looking at water policy and different types of planning. So all that's going on in 1937, getting that going. And the first water delivered out of the Colorado Big Thompson project didn't happen until 1957. So again, these things take a lot of time, but that was a huge change for this area and for the state. Along as that was happening, we have Representative Wayne Aspinall, who was elected from Colorado to the U.S. House. He served there for more than 20 years. So he is very significant, especially in terms of Western land and water issues as the House representative. In the 1950s, he was very involved in the creation of the Colorado River Storage Project. So that was a project that focused on the Colorado River and developing that river further. So building more dams, reservoirs, storing water, again, mostly for irrigation purposes. So he worked on that. It was going great. Lots of people had supported it, except for this project that was proposed as part of the Colorado River Storage Project called Echo Park Dam. So that was a dam that was proposed to be built on the Green River, northwest Colorado, and what is now Dinosaur National Monument. The group of people really opposed this, really had various reasons why they did not want this particular dam to happen, and they were successful. So sometimes history is about what doesn't happen in this case. And so it did get removed from the legislation, and this Echo Park Dam did not get built. This is part of the beginning of the environmental era, not only in Colorado, but across the United States. This was post-World War II, when people had more money, there was more prosperity, there was more mobility, people were traveling more, getting outside, recreating more in nature, and people just had some different ideas about let's not build dams everywhere. Let's set aside some places to not build dams. And so that environmental movement, that environmental era is still occurring today. Locally, I'm sure you've heard of the group called Save the Pooter. It's very active in protecting the pooter. That is the latest incarnation of a group to protect the pooter, that's working to protect the pooter. There have been earlier ones, there have been different ones earlier, some called Friends of the Pooter, Preserve Our Pooter, the Pooter River Trust. So Save the Pooter, the current group, is just the latest incarnation doing what they're doing. Another outgrowth of the environmental era was some federal legislation. The US government created the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So that was another way to protect rivers. And then there was the creation of national heritage areas. And locally, the Pooter River has both of those designations, which is unique within the state. So that's super significant for water. And when we talk about water and water history, we have to include groundwater. It's another important part of our water supply. Mostly are talking about water, or surface water, but groundwater is significant too. It's actually been increasing in use since about the 1930s into the 40s and 50s, when the technology, the pumping technology especially, was really improving and developing. And so people were just able to pump more water out of the ground and put that, again, mostly to use for irrigation. So by the 1950s, with this increasing use, the state was seeing, hey, maybe we've got some things here we need to work out. And it was by 1965 with the Colorado Groundwater Management Act that the state really incorporated groundwater into the prior appropriation system. So groundwater and surface water being in the same system, looking at being that first in time, first in right priority use. Not an easy thing to do, incorporating a new supply into the existing system, but they got it worked out starting in the 50s into the 1960s with this act. Locally, one of the most significant things that has happened with groundwater in this area happened during 2002. So that was the year there was a major drought, really affected this region. And that summer, the state engineer shut down hundreds of groundwater wells in Weld County especially, and other, places on the eastern plains. Really needed to cut back, the use of that water. Devastated, farmers, devastated agricultural crops in that area, and, you're still seeing some of the effects of that today. And so on the flip side of droughts, we get floods. So one of the worst floods in the state history happened in this area in 1976. So this was the Big Thompson flood. So basically a huge rainstorm, July 31st, hit the Big Thompson Canyon in this area. The Poudre River was also affected, but just not quite as badly. So we mostly talk about the Big Thompson flood in 1976. But that evening and as they discovered during the cleanup, 144 people were killed in that flood, and more than $35 million worth of damage. Certainly not a great situation, but more people had been moving into that area. More tourists were traveling to this area, and people just got caught off guard. Just were not ready for it. Didn't know what was happening. Didn't know what to expect and how to prepare. If you've been in the canyon and seen the signs that say, in case of flooding, climb to safety, those are a lesson from this flood. People stayed in their cars and didn't make it out. And so that's the advice now: get out, climb to safety if you're in a flooding situation. Other lessons came out of that too. We've also had more recent floods that have hit this area, being both in 1997 and in 2013. And it's also important to talk about our Native American friends when we talk about water history. And so here we're going to go step back to 1908 real quick, when the U.S. Supreme Court decided the Winters case, often talked about as the Winters Doctrine. But this was when they decided that through this case, they decided that a tribe's water rights dated back to the establishment of the reservation. So that meant whenever those reservations got established, and in Colorado, we have two. We have the Ute Mountain Ute tribes, each with their own reservation. So when those were established, they were guaranteed water rights. Unfortunately, for decades, most of those water rights were not quantified, were not measured, were not guaranteed. But by 1988, 80 years later, Congress ratified the Colorado Ute Indian Water Rights Settlement, which meant that the two tribes in Colorado have guaranteed and quantified water rights. In other states, other tribes are still working on these issues. So it may not sound like much, but it was a pretty big deal for Colorado's tribes. And we'll talk about endangered species really quick. There are endangered species issues related to water across the state that different groups have been working on for decades. This particular situation started the three states came together, Colorado, Nebraska, and Wyoming came together in 1994, along with the federal government, to work out some endangered species issues on the Platte River. So instead of they knew there were issues with these species. So instead of just watching and letting it happen, the three states and the government came together to say, how can we manage the river differently to benefit these species, preserve them, and not let them become endangered and potentially extinct? So this resulted, it took years, like this says, cooperative agreement in 1997, further conflicts, didn't get those resolved till 2006. The program began actually operating in 2007, and it's called the Platte River Recovery Implementation Program. Still in effect today. It's been reauthorized, still working to protect these species. If you're curious what they are, they're typically summarized as 3 birds and a fish. So the 3 birds are the whooping crane, the piping plover, and the least tern, and the fish is the pallid sturgeon. So not necessarily species you're like looking forward to seeing each and every day, but important again for the ecology and the environment of the area. And our last stop on our geographical historical timeline is 2005. So this is the year that the Colorado legislature passed House Bill 1177. So this is legislation that set up Colorado's basin roundtables as well as the Interbasin Compact Committee. So the idea of the Interbasin Compact Committee was modeled on the concept of interstate river compacts. Basically, how can we get different groups together to talk about issues and resolve them collaboratively? The basin roundtables were set up for each of the major river basins in the state to discuss issues within those basins. And so they have representation across diverse interests. They're again still in operation today, just discussing things, coming together to understand each other, understand common issues, and make some plans, figure out what to do. One outgrowth of this has been that the basins fed information kind of up the system to the Colorado Water Conservation Board, who in 2015 released the very first state water plan. So it's a huge deal to have for any state to have a water plan. This was Colorado's first after all this time. And it was really fed, really informed by the Basin Roundtable discussion process. That there has been an updated and revised state water plan a few years ago, but that's really the guiding document I get at the state level for what can be done to solve Colorado's water problems, water issues, and look at things going forward. So that's all I've got today. History continues. We'll continue, I'm sure, to see environmental challenges, challenges because of a growing population, changing values that we all bring to the situation. And I'm hopeful that from our historical lessons, we can continue to bring forth some collaboration and some innovation. So with that, happy to answer questions.
Anyway, that groundwater issue, was there no prior appropriation rights for people who've been pumping for 100 years? Or did that factor in at all to the negotiation?
So you're talking about the groundwater well situation?
Yes,
or
the
the
wells,
legislation?
I'm tired, and, yeah, the wells versus the river.
Yes.
And if it's somebody who's been pumping for 75 years, did they get any credit for that? As far as prior appropriation, or was it just, it sounds like they just turned them all off.
Do you know the detail?
No, so groundwater development, installation of wells didn't really kick off until like the drought here, like the 30s.
Oh, all
There
right.
was the increase, and then in the 50s, there was a huge increase of installation of
Well,
wells.
that would be blasted.
So they're definitely not, among the early water rights. But I don't know specifically how, that was incorporated into the system. They don't just turn them off. The case that Patty was talking about is a very specific year where, they did.
Yeah.
But because they were low priority.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
A lot of the wells do have that really low priority, and just because they were
Okay,
developed
all right.
later. But there's also a concept of augmentation plans, and not to get too technical, but it's a situation where the wells can pump out of priority, and everybody agrees to that. You can pump out of your priority in the system, but you have to replace what you use. So you have to
Right.
augment your use, and it gets complicated. And I don't know all the details of how it all goes.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
so a lot of times what happens is a farmer will pump, and use water out of priority, so his water right date for his groundwater is later than, let's say, a surface water right on the river, so he's getting that water out of priority, but he will replace it at a different time of the year, so he augments his diversion by replacing that water.
So
Let's
they
say
would
on
pump
the
water
winter.
from from the ground and put it in the river? Is that how he augments it?
Actually vice versa.
Well, there are different ones. Some of the groundwater, rights owners, um, have basically bought into a system that has developed other water, like might have stored it in a reservoir. And so if I'm pumping, my augmentation plan might say, well, I bought water rights over there, and they will put it back in the river to replace what, so yeah.
Yeah.
Very quick and not longer. So my first one was judge finding the judge and you got to do a term of all wells on these terms.
I think so. I mean, I know his name. I forget exactly when he retired. Yeah. Yeah, that's
not that, that was
Okay.
just for my personal.
okay.
And then, were the Ute tribes extended very senior water rights, even though they were kind of retroactive? Because I would imagine that the Native Americans were utilizing the river way before settlers. Do they have good water rights, I guess, or strong?
My understanding is they do have quite early, which would say senior.
Right.
Is that the date of the water right?
Or do they retroactively say you were the first? Yeah.
Well, I think it's based on the reservation date,
Oh,
the
okay.
establishment, not saying you were here 1,000 years ago, you get all this, you know.
Wasn't
So,
Yeah, there's still kind of a date that's imposed by us.
Doesn't that seem
Yeah.
nice?
Okay, and then my third question was just, when and how did the Army Corps of Engineers become such a big player in water projects? Clearly that's a federal.
yes, the Army Corps of Engineers, they've existed since at least the Civil War, if not before, probably before. They haven't been as active as, big players in the West. They're mostly concerned with the East, partly because they do a lot of flood control type projects. But I know in particular, the John Martin Dam on the Arkansas River is a Corps of Engineers project. Some of it's just territorial battles between the two government agencies. Sometimes it's who's got the funding. Sometimes it's, this is properly a reclamation, like directly, we're going to irrigate with it. So
They
it's
still have a
between,
piece of approving, like NIST and Allegan and all, like, don't you have to get certification by the Army Corps of Engineers as part of your project? And it takes forever. Typically.
I think they are one of the agencies that issues a permit to, approve something, but I don't know the ins and outs.
That Lakeland organization was sued by the Poudre River. They sued the Corps on this.
Yeah, we'll learn about permitting and we have like a northern water session in.
Thank you.
Yeah, you'll get the details. Any other questions?
Thank you, Patty.
Yep.
Okay, and are you staying for lunch or you have to take off?
I have to take lunch.
If you would.
Yeah.
Well, we are going to have a lunch break. So typically what we do is we grab our lunch, which is out there, come back in, we'll have some time for discussion and crinkling of paper. And then we will have our next speaker, which is Martine Carcassonne, who was in the corner before. He'll come back and join us around 12:40. And then we'll have a little bit of time at the end for reflection. So grab your lunches. It should have your name on your lunch up there. What's that? Alphabetical order by first name. So, and if you don't see it there, we'll figure it out. We also we'll get some beverages out here. Help yourself.
I know I. So I was saying. He's working on that. They were really like. Yeah, but I was like, from there, I'm like getting ready and this was where those people help me do. It's got, I was like. Yeah. I was like, like, well, let's. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it was like funny enough, like, oh, this must be just. Meeting minutes and all kind of. And more of this very not to see that. Yeah.
Fine things, and she runs over the audience, her dad's there. It's so cute.
Fortunately,
Yeah, so.
Here, let's get you all set
I
up.
think what I'm gonna try to do is use my computer, because I got some software that I'm using on there.
Okay.
But I think if I just call into the Zoom,
Yeah.
then I can just share my screen. So do you know the
Yeah,
Zoom link? Or-
slightly
Well.
complicated situation where like the screen connects to this thing.
Right.
And I don't, you might have to like install something.
Well, that's what I'm saying is, if I go into the Zoom, I can just share my screen. with- So you're still projecting that computer. We don't have to project my computer, right? I just need to get on the Zoom.
A professor. That's funny because I could have done the same thing this morning. I did not.
I mean, we've had this issue before. I've always noticed it's a little complicated here. So I'm like, oh, wait a second. If you have someone on Zoom already, just want to email me the Zoom link.
Yeah.
Or
So, you know.
type in the meeting.